Hello everyone and welcome to another devlog about my little need-based city sim I've been working on. Last time we left off, I had a couple of little sprites going around doing random stuff like sleeping in a bed or going to the supermarket and cooking some food. And it got me wondering, what's the next step? How am I going to start making this into a living, breathing city? I'm not talking about adding more gameplay mechanics or even how I'm gonna do the procedural generation, just like what do I want the city to look like visually? Like what are the assets I'm gonna have to create for this thing and how am I going to pump them into the engine? And that's kind of tricky because I've been working on a whole bunch of different games throughout my life, and every single time the way to approach generating asset is a little bit different. And because I'm not an artist in any shape, way or form, I don't have that much experience, or I don't know exactly how to create those assets. Right now I just borrowed an asset pack from Kenny online, and I could keep doing that, finding free assets or even purchasing some online. But if I'm going to model a whole city, I'm gonna need a whole bunch of assets, and if I keep like taking assets from left and right online, or if I start making like temporary asset like a blue square or a yellow triangle or something, it's gonna become really difficult to figure out what is what, you know? Like, is this a fridge or a bush? I don't know. So I figured I need to sit down and think about what the asset pipeline is going to be for my game. And it's a subject I've been wanting to talk into more detail because I have some experience. But the problem is a lot of it is on the art side, and I'm no artist, so I don't have much experience on the actual art asset generation side of thing. And it's a very difficult subject to approach because it'll depend a lot on what you're comfortable with and what tools you're using and what you need for your game. For example, you might have a game designer coming in and talking to the artist about what kind of character he wants. Oh, I want a lady with green hair. And there's a million ways he could do that, like on a napkin or on a corner table, on a whiteboard, but also like inside a Photoshop, or even now, of course, using AI. And then this is going to be passed to a bunch of other artists that are going to model it or, you know, make pixel art out of it, maybe texture it, also animate it. And these are all different people usually in a big production. And finally, you know, someone has to take all of these assets and put them in the game. And this is going to be very different depending on the engine you're using. If you're using Godot, you'll want to export them as GLTF. But if you're using Unreal or Unity, it's probably going to be FBX. And Unreal has a lot of useful tools to package textures in very specific ways. So it's going to be different than if you're using Unity or Godot or GameMaker or whatever. And there's also considerations of how you're going to approach the performance of your game. You know, are you aiming to make a very small game that's portable on a lot of different platforms and stuff? Then maybe you want to, you know, use texture atlas or, you know, trim sheets or something like that. Or are you going for like a really realistic style? Then you might end up with like 200 gigabytes of textures asset. And honestly, I was a little bit lost in all of this. So originally, I was thinking this game would be a top-down 2D game, a little bit like the Dwarf Fortress Steam version, or maybe the original Grand Theft Auto 1 and 2 for those old enough to remember that. But I started thinking about how many sprites I would have to generate for this to make sense. I mean, have you looked at the sprite folder in Dwarf Fortress? Have you seen how many drawings there are? And there isn't even animation in Dwarf Fortress. And I got kind of intimidated because I'm not the 2D artist. So I was wondering, maybe if especially I want to be able to compose sprites from different pieces, like, you know, be able to swap the head on my NPCs to create variation, or create buildings from a bunch of different building blocks. Maybe this would be easier in 3D. Now, I can think of a couple of games that do this really well in 2D, like RimWorld, for example, and maybe Oxygen Not Included, or games like that. But I think these games were designed by people really, really, really good at 2D art. Like, they live and breathe pixel art. Or they've developed this style over like many, many years from what I've read online. So in my case, I thought maybe it'll be easier to just have, 3D animations that I can reuse and then plug them to create different variation. For a while now, I've been a fan of another fellow YouTuber called Infenzia.
That's right, Control R.
And I really like his approach to modeling. Now, he's not the only one who's doing low poly models and stuff, but his method really clicked with me because he puts more emphasis on the modeling part than on the texturing part. And I do love modeling in Blender. I just never really got the hang of texturing. I just don't like UV unwrapping and texturing my models. So the idea of doing low poly texture atlas kind of modeling really appealed to me because I thought I could make models really quickly, import them into the game really easily. It's at worst a couple of clicks to set the material, and at best, if I really want to, I can make a script that does it in one click. Now I'm a little bit worried that it can be compared to like low effort asset flips or something. But that's something I can tackle later, and I can always come back and refine the models at a later point if I need to. So with that in mind, I started producing some basic assets. I basically remade what I already had, but in 3D. So I made like a table, a chair, a refrigerator, a couple of characters, stuff like that. I also looked at a bunch of online tutorial on how to create like building blocks that you can compose to create environment, like creating rooms and floor and stuff based on just a single grid that you can tile together to create your whole building. It wasn't that difficult because there wasn't so many things depending on like being 2D or 3D. Of course, I had to switch in the code a couple of vector 2 to vector 3. But the big change I had to do was add collision and pathfinding, because up until now, my little AIs were just, moving around on a 2D grid. But now in 3D, I actually needed gravity and collision and all this kind of stuff, which also meant pathfinding. Now, thankfully, Godot has a built-in nav mesh system that can help you do pathfinding really easily. But it's a little bit finicky, and I had to spend a lot of time learning how to tweak it to make it work the way I wanted. Right now, the game is on a 2 meter by 2 meter kind of grid. So all my pieces are 2 meter by 2 meter. And I can tile them and I can assemble them to create a little bit of a city. Another thing I try to work on is the world environment to set up stuff like bloom and fog and the lighting to give it a kind of cyberpunk, dark, rainy city style. But that's something I'm still very much struggling with. So if you have any recommendation and tips on how to set up a proper environment, I'm all ears because that stuff is difficult for me. I mentioned in previous episodes that I'm doing this project as a way to challenge myself because I've never really worked on AI, and especially a need-based AI system is something I've never tackled. So I'm always looking for ways to kind of break my current architecture to see if it's flexible enough to do what I want it to do. And the move to 3D kind of unlocked a couple of really interesting pain points that I ran into, especially with animation and synchronizing different animations in 3D. But that's gonna be a subject for the next episode. So until then, see you all in my next episode. Bye!